Do we need to turn this? Can we make this a little bigger? Sure. Okay. Morning, everyone. Let's get started. I'll open this up in prayer. Father in heaven, we give thanks for another day, another week, another chance to fellowship together, another chance to discuss the scriptures, another chance to express our faith in you, to be together. Bless us today, bless us in everything we do. Help us have faith. Help us walk away better. Help us walk away more prepared. Pray this in the name of Christ Jesus. Amen. Good morning. Today we're going to cover the manuscripts of the New Testament. The Old Testament was actually a much longer discussion than we're going to have. It was actually, the Old Testament is significantly more difficult in some ways. And from a time period perspective, the Old Testament lasted a long time. The New Testament lasted a very short period of time. And so therefore, it totally makes sense actually to do this one a little bit more quickly. So some preliminary thoughts before we get into things. First of all, just as a general note, the New Testament is the best attested ancient book. All right, we're going to talk about statistics today, and it's not close, actually. It is just an extremely well attested ancient book. If we're just talking about the numbers, and we will. This does not stop scholars from making stuff up. All right, like one of my favorites is this. It's the argument that the Gospels were not written by the apostles. These were all actually works of like oral tradition in like a church, and like a church wrote them, and they were disseminated. And when they were first disseminated, they weren't associated with an apostle, but later on, the apostles' names were attached to them. And that's how we got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's literally no physical evidence for this at all. There is no New Testament manuscript that has like someone else's name on the top of Matthew. All right, it's just kind of made up. There are dissertations that must be written. There are things that people do because they need creative things to say, and also some of it's more nefarious. They'll make up stuff for that reason. But the fact that this is the best attested ancient book still does not stop people from making stuff up. And I'm sure I've said this, but manuscript means written by hand. We know that? Script. And this is a manus, right? Latin, manuscript. Just note. So what this means is we stop talking about manuscripts, generally speaking, when the printing press comes, right? Because at that point, it's not that people don't write, it's that you don't mass produce books by hand, generally speaking, right? If you have religious reasons for still copying things, then some people will do it. Jews do it. Muslims do it. But the Christian church did not feel like, okay, well, we need to keep hand copying things. So when we talk about manuscripts, we're talking about basically from inception to the printing press. And at that point, it's the history of publication, not the history of manuscripts. And just also another general note, and this is kind of logical, but I just want to say it, all right, because some people think it's a huge deal. The more manuscripts you have, generally speaking, the more variants you will have. What is a variant? A variant is if you take a standard where this is going to be our standard text, and we're going to go through and we're going to record all the variants, the mistakes, misspellings, whatever when somebody did with a copy. And so, for example, let's say that the average rate, if you're going to copy an entire book, all right, is 100 mistakes in that book, all right? And Rhonda copies a book, and she makes 100 mistakes. There are, if you compare that to the original, 100 variants, all right? Now that if Grady copies that book, and he also makes the average 100 mistakes, there's now twice as many variants, all right? Then if we lose the original manuscript, all right, there's now 200 variants, and that's terrible. Actually, no, because there's 2 copies, we're better off. Now you multiply that. If you have 10 people copy that book, and they all make mistakes as well, 100 mistakes, all right? You're now going to have 1,000 variants, but you also have 1,000 copies that you can check, you have 10 copies you can check against each other, all right? And so variants, all right, unless you do something specific to make sure no variants ever get into the stream, all right? These are often a sign of something healthy. The New Testament has a lot of variants because it has way more manuscripts than any ancient work. 5, we'll get there, all right? I'll stop belaboring the point, all right? So, there's lots of variants, and people like to talk about, oh, the New Testament manuscript tradition has a lot of variants. It does. There's a lot of manuscripts. And secondly, we do not hide our variants. Some traditions have taken a point of saying we're going to destroy all manuscripts that have variants. Like, for example, the Quran, so I'm told. And it's actually not a terrible idea. There's some great things about variants, though, because you know somebody's not trying to control the stream of the text. Christian scribes, of course, tried to not make mistakes, generally speaking, I'm sure, but there is no master control of the New Testament manuscripts, and no one's hiding anything, because no one can. From a textual criticism perspective, there is no ancient book that is studied as much as the New Testament has been and published on as much. And so there's like nothing secret, all right? So there's no, oh no, if only people knew this kind of thing. It's all public. It's published on, it's commented on in commentaries. It's actually a big subject and has been for a very long time. So there's really nothing to hide from textual criticism standpoint. A note we've made before. There is no viable variant that affects any form of any cardinal doctrine of the Christian faith, all right? No viable, meaning nothing you actually could argue for from an evidence perspective, that affects a cardinal doctrine of the faith, all right? Nothing from the Christianity is going to fall perspective or stand is affected by the variants of the Greek New Testament, all right? Because there's no viable variant. There are some that are pretty scandalous, but they're not viable. And there are some, all right, that do affect the meaning, but it's usually really minor, all right? We'll talk about one of those today, all right? So on the one hand, there's nothing that's at stake here. On the other hand, this is the most important book in the world, and people do need to spend time on recovering the text. Amen. At least in my opinion, it's the most important book in the world. But there are important variants, and we'll talk about some of them. Let's just talk about some numbers, all right? Homer. So this would be the Iliad and the Odyssey. One of them, I think it was the Iliad, had significantly more than others. But there are 1,757 manuscripts of the Greek of Homer, all right? Most of them are fragmentary. By fragmentary, I mean very small pieces. 439 of Plato, all right? And, I mean, these are very important ancient writers. All right, Lucretius. This is he has about 50 manuscripts. Most of them are fragmentary, most of them are quotes. Really? Lucretius was about as close as you can get to an atheist in the ancient world. He was a Roman. I read his work as a part of a book club. It was very interesting. Sophocles, all right? The man, the legend. There's like 200 manuscripts for his very few plays that survived. I think it was 7 plays of his survived. And he wrote a few hundred. All right? Josephus, we know Josephus, historian, 120. My favorite writer of ancient Greek, Lucian of Samosata. He's funny. Not that many. Hebrew Old Testament, 850. Many of these are fragmentary from Qumran. The New Testament, 5,900. All right? 5,900. Now, if you take out the fragmentary, all right, that's actually going to change these accounts a lot. There are some New Testament fragments. Most New Testament manuscripts are actually very large chunks, whole books, collections of books. And so, from a numbers count, Homer looks like it's about a third of the New Testament. From a word count perspective, it's not close at all, actually. If you put all that in a graph, this is what it looks like. All right? New Testament there on the right, Hebrew next to it, Homer. All right? If you take out the fragments, it's going to look something like this. All right? It is extremely lopsided. Extremely lopsided in terms of counts. And we're talking about ancient books. Now, some of these is talk about how old they are. All right? Now, Homer was the most popular book in the ancient world. It would have been written down somewhere in the 800s, thousands, somewhere around there. All right? There's a lot of fragments that were like dug up in Egypt. It was super popular amongst the Greeks then. But in terms of large manuscripts, there's very few. Plato, about 300 years before Christ. Lucretius, a century before Christ. Sophocles, about 300 years before Christ. Josephus, contemporary of Jesus. A little younger, I think, but contemporary of Jesus. He was active in the war from Rome against Jerusalem in AD 70. So he was active before that. He switched sides before that, before AD 70. Lucian of Samosata, he's a couple centuries after Jesus. And still, the New Testament, just a bulk number of manuscripts, just dominates the ancient world. We're going to look at examples of all of these types today. When you basically break up that large number of manuscripts, this is your rough count of how that works out. Textual critics, those who concern themselves with reconstructing the original text based on the variants. This is their typical grouping. And they organize the number and think through everything. First of all, papyri. Because papyri are generally older. And so they just treat papyri separately. They're just their own separate important category. Then there are majuscules and minuscules. Majus being just larger, and minus being, well, smaller. So think of fancy capital letter writing. We've seen some of those before. And somebody's writing in cursive. That's a minuscule. All right? And the reason why they make this distinction, other than just its handwriting is very different, is majuscules are typically older because the minuscule of the cursive writing that I'll show you came later. All right? And so, generally speaking, if you see one with the big uppercase capitals all the time, it's older. That's just a basic rule of thumb. Not always. That's generally the case. And then there are lectionaries. And lectionaries are going to be of these type, but they're specifically readings organized for a church service. And so we have a lot of manuscripts that were just written specifically for somebody goes in front of the church and reads the text. All right? And those are all lectionaries. And so we'll look at all of these. So the papyri, there's not nearly as many. So that's that little portion, right? Then you've got a small number of majuscules, then you have a lot of these minuscules. And we'll connect these terms to actual manuscripts here in a minute. We're going to look at about 5. All right? You stop now. Any questions about anything we discussed so far? Yes, Catherine?
Do the lectionaries, is it pure scripture or would there be like commentary mixed in?
Good question. She asked, are lectionaries pure scripture or is there commentary mixed in? It is pure scripture. There'll be little headings in it. But commentaries are something that they did in the ancient world where they'd have like a little bit of text and then they have commentary about it. Lectionaries are pure text. Yeah.
Is there any kind of division between the East and the West?
This is actually just Greek, so this is pure East.
Okay.
Yeah. This doesn't even count. So there's another category of manuscripts that are called the versions. All right. And versions are translations into other languages. And so if you take the versions of the New Testament, you add, if I remember right, about 16,000 manuscripts to the New Testament tradition. So this is purely just Greek. Yeah. Yes.
I heard just many years ago that it was common in the ancient times for people to write manuscripts and like if they messed up they would throw it or throw it away. Is there any proof of that actually happening to reduce variance?
Not that I can think of, though I'm sure it happened. But if somebody picked up a manuscript and they're like, wow, this is terrible, they throw it away. But I can't think of anything in particular. Yeah. Not for the New Testament. Somebody else have anything?
Is there like a cutoff date for if something counts as towards this manuscript count?
16th century,
Okay.
the printing press. So during the century of the printing press, there were still people writing handwritten, and so those are still. But most people stop. Oh wait, Erasmus now is printed his Greek New Testament. I'm going to stop. Spending really long periods of time probably. Yeah, so the 16th century, the Gutenberg. Good question. Anything else? Stop me at any time. This is what a modern critical edition looks like. And so this is from what is called a Nestle Aland 28. Nestle Aland being the tradition of editors of a particular volume. 28 being the 28th edition of that volume. And so every, 10 years, number of years, they come out with a new edition, all right? And what a critical edition is, all right, is a critical edition is they are not following one manuscript. They are looking at all of the manuscripts, looking at the variants, and then saying, this we think is the most likely text. And then, typically, in a critical edition that's meant for text critical study, they will have down here, and in this one up here, you see, here's the text. This is Romans chapter 2. You'll see a bunch of Old Testament references and other things over here on the left. At the bottom is what is called the textual apparatus. We've seen a textual apparatus before. We saw it several weeks ago. And so this is, you read this, and then they have important or useful or interesting textual variants at the bottom. And these symbols all mean something. And the manuscripts have numbers, or they have symbols, or this Gothic M actually means an entire tradition of manuscripts, or I mentioned the versions a second ago. This refers to the Syriac translation of the New Testament, and so forth. And so this is what a critical edition looks like. And usually when people go to seminary and study Greek, they use one of these. There are other types of editions, though, like, for example, in theory, some would still use what would be called the Textus Receptus. This would be the text printed by Erasmus and adopted by the KJV. Those who are very KJV only are very attached to the Textus Receptus, and so they will often reject anything that's not the Textus Receptus, depending on how attached they are. If you are a KJV only kind of guy, so I don't know if any of us are, but I don't think so. But if you are, that tends to be the case. right? Because the KJV has specific things in it that you can find in the Texas Receptus that you won't find in any sort of, certainly no critical edition. Yes, Isaac.
Why are people
Say that again.
Why are people
Why are people KJV only? Probably for a host of reasons. Some of it's, some people make the apologetic of, well, the KJV was so influential for so many hundred years that God must have blessed it, right? It's actually not any different than the same argument that some people made for the Septuagint, right? God worked through the Septuagint and God is blessed through the Septuagint, therefore we should read through the Septuagint, not the Hebrew Bible. So that would be one reason. It's just the argument for its effectiveness. Some will argue also that a lot of this other stuff is attempts to change the theology of the Bible, all right? And it's not true. Some of it is fear. There's a lot of fear related to this because if ultimately you've grown up using the KJV and someone else uses a translation that has something in it that you don't have, if you are too tightly attached to that specific edition, that can damage your faith. And so some people look at that and are just going to double down on saying, no, this was it. This is, the Texas Receptus was it. So there's a few different things that go into it. I think KJV onlyism is dying, as far as I know. It's just kind of going away. We'll have reason in a minute if we have time to read from the KJV. Because we'll talk about one of the textual variants there. Good question, though. Anybody else? So most modern scholars will use it in a text like this, an eclectic text, which pulls from different manuscripts. Some people just go with a majority text, which would be similar to the Textus Receptus, but not the same. But there are also the minority. This is the majority. So that's what a modern critical edition would look like. Now let's talk about some variants. If you would turn to John chapter 7. And the first three that we have are famous variants. And so I figured I'd start with some of those. But I specifically wanted to pick one that really would change how you read a book. A chapter. We're going to talk about Romans 5 as the last one, assuming we have time. But this one right here is probably the most famous one. All right. If you go to the end of John, all right. If you go to the end of John, you will see verse 53, like in my ESV, like it has chapter 8 and it has verse 53 like grouped with chapter 8, but it is verse 53. And has like double brackets there. And it says, the earliest manuscripts do not include 753 through 811. So this is the story of the woman caught in adultery in John. The earliest manuscripts do not have this text. And so when that kind of thing happens, all right, you have to ask questions, all right? Why? And you would start asking things like, okay, is there something about this text that an early Christian would be offended at? And so therefore they would take it out. No, it's a great text, all right? There's nothing theologically odd about it, really. What's the chance that some early Christians, when they were copying the manuscript, they just missed this very large section, all right? It could have happened. Somebody might have just missed an entire page, and somebody copied from that manuscript, and so they lost it. So it's possible, all right? What modern scholars will do, and what is reflected in most of your Bibles probably, is they'll say, well, what's more likely is somebody inserted it in a manuscript later. It was a free-floating tradition. It was a story about Jesus, and so they inserted it here. All right. Now, no Bible that I know of, no Bible translation I know of removes it. All right. But it's there. All right, and it's encouraging, and I love the text. But that's why they put in brackets that the earliest manuscripts do not have this particular section. It just, verse 52, and then goes on, continues on at 8:12. Yes.
So is there like a branch where, okay, now manuscripts of equal date, some from this area have the story, and others from this area do not have the story?
So everything later pretty much has it.
Oh.
That's the thing. It's just super common. And so once it came into the tradition, once it came into the stream, it stayed in the stream. And so nobody was like, no. And so, and I don't remember the earliest one that has this, and the same thing will be true of the next one we look at, but it's, when the textual critics look at it, they're like, when you've got large chunks missing, you kind of got to come up with a reason for it, all right? And for most, the most reasonable explanation is it was added in later. Because it's a harder thing to go, well, why would you take it out? This seems like a strange thing to actually take out of the tradition. So that's one example. The next one was arguably the other really super famous one. And this one is actually fairly easy to explain, I think. So if you would turn to the very end of Mark. At least fairly, well, you could explain it going different ways. If you go to the end of Mark, all right, this is a hard question. It's not like this is an easy question, so I'll take that back. If you go to 16:8, you will see, and they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they had said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. All right? And then if you, my ESV has a note here that says, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include 16:9 through 20. And actually, there is a later, and I'm thinking anybody takes it seriously, there's a later ending for Mark. It got added to some manuscripts that's even shorter than this. But pretty much, most people say you've got two choices. One, Mark ends where our Bibles have them, or Mark ends in 16:8. All right? That's pretty much it. Now, how could something like this happen? How could you, all right? How could you, in an early manuscript, lose the middle of a book? Definitely possible. If it's a scroll, very hard to do so. How could you lose the beginning of a book? Well, it's the first page on a scroll. It'd be really easy to lose, actually. If something is going to get destroyed on a scroll, it's going to be the piece on the outside, right? What about the piece on the innermost, which is where this particular piece would be? If it was a scroll, that's the most protected piece of the manuscript. It's like wrapped inside everything else. And so for it to be destroyed, chances are that one would have to be destroyed too. All right? What if, though, Mark was written as a codex? Now you have two most likely things to get destroyed first. The first page and the last page. All right? And so, what's going on here? One of three things is likely true. Either, A, all this text should be here, all right? And some part of the tradition on one of the manuscripts, it lost its last page, and some early manuscripts were copied from that one, and so therefore it didn't have the last page too. That's actually a reasonable argument, I think, all right? And then later on, the tradition was like, no, we've had this other page, all right? And so that other page essentially comes back, or never left the tradition. It's just it takes over because people recognize, oh yeah, we were missing that page in this particular string. That's one option. Two, it was written later, and they added it because they thought that's a really strange way to end the Gospel of Mark, for they were afraid. And what's even weirder about it, from a kind of a Greek perspective, that hardly any ancient work actually ends with the word it ends with, because like sentences don't end with the word it ends with. because it's a weird conjunction. And so people say, no, you wouldn't end a work. You wouldn't end a sentence like this, much less a book with this particular word, which is actually a pretty decent argument. And so therefore, the shorter ending can't be it. It must be this longer ending. Or somebody said, it can't end this way, and they write it, all right? Or they write it because they felt, this is just awkward. We really need to talk about some more things about the resurrection, and put this at the end of the gospel. And of course, the other option would be that we actually did lose the last page of Mark. Mark wrote it, and there was a page or two missing, and we don't have it. Which one is the answer? I don't know. Wish I knew. That'd be great. Most modern textual critics tend to say this was added on later. Right? They'll do that for both manuscript reasons, but also stylistic reasons. The Greek is kind of different. And so it'd be weird for Mark to write a little bit differently once you get past this verse. And so for that reason, I tend to say, no, probably not. Also, just from a practical standpoint, you've got like poison drinkers who really love this passage. And you kind of want to stick it to them and say, no, it's not. No, don't tread on serpents. Anyway, but that's not actually a valid reason to do it. But FYI, that's basically your options with this particular text. Mark wrote it and it's lost. Mark wrote it and we have that what's there. Or Mark didn't write that last part and it ended with, for they were afraid. And intentionally left it as a sort of a cliffhanger. And Max, I heard that. Yes.
So codices were a common format, like in the first century?
No, but this is the thing. Christians didn't seem to use the scrolls.
But they didn't use scrolls?
Didn't seem to.
Okay.
And so the Christians love the Codex. And for good reason. It's way better in every way. But that would be part of the argument of the only way to argue that we lost, there's an ending of Mark that was there and we lost it, is that it was written and transmitted on a codex almost from the very beginning. Yeah.
Do you know of any church fathers that quoted the longer end of Mark?
It is not in my memory, no. But that church, Michael asked if any, what church fathers would have quoted from the last ending of Mark. That is a factor that people use in textual criticism. And that's used for actually all documents. And so when people quote Homer, that ends up in the text critical discussions of Homer. For the New Testament, it does as well. The fathers excessively quote both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so there would definitely be some data there. I don't happen to know it. It's a good question. Yeah.
Just a comment that this may sound like a big deal to us because we're all sort of rationalist, enlightenment thinkers, and we're the heirs of that project, which is way, way after this. But it doesn't seem like it really bothered the early Christians. They were much more concerned with the message.
I think that's true. And most of them, A, they were particularly concerned with the message, and B, most would not know differences, right? They didn't have critical text. I say most because that did become a discussion, like even Origen. He wrote something called the Hexapla, where he wrote, like in multiple columns, stuff about the Septuagint. Well, here's the tradition we received for the Septuagint, and this is this guy's translation and this guy's translation. Here's the Hebrew, and so forth. And so you do have early textual critics. But for the most part, the church has been sort of like my thought whenever we were talking about the New Testament canon. We receive the scriptures by faith. And if I don't have those last verses of Mark, it's okay, right? And it was okay for the early Christians too, if they didn't have those last verses of Mark. They had what they had by faith and they lived that way, and that's fine. I'm sorry, that's not fine. That's correct. That is good, not fine. It is fantastic. And so, yeah, I don't think there was a great deal of concern over this. And it's only really a concern for us is if we need to know for sure that my faith rests on, we have zero variance in our New Testament, right? And that is a terrible thing to base your faith on. That really is a very poor choice. So we generally wouldn't make a big deal out of it. Some people do make a very big deal though out of the ending of Mark, because some people make a big deal out of everything. If you would turn to 1 John chapter 5. And I'm going to have you all read, because this one's funny. I actually really like this one. The history of this is funny. 1 John chapter 5. You have your KJV? If you'd read that for us, Edwin. First, 7 and 8.
For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And these three are one. And there are three that bear witness in earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood. And these three agree in one.
Okay, thank you. I'm using the ESV, and my verse 7 is very short. There are three that testify. Verse 8, the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And these three agree. That longer section that is very Trinitarian, all right, does not exist in a Greek manuscript until about the 1500s, all right? And here's why it's funny. It was common in the Latin tradition and was used for Trinitarian doctrine for obvious reasons. Erasmus, who printed the first and published the first Greek New Testament, in his first two editions did not include that extended version, all right? And people gave him a hard time about it. They're like, we love this verse. You should really include that. And he's like, tell you what, if you show me a single Greek manuscript with that in it, I will put it in. And lo and behold, they found one, all right? And a lot of people were like, they probably just wrote it there, and so they gave it to him so it would show up. And so Erasmus put it in his Greek New Testament, and therefore it became a part of the Textus Receptus, and therefore it came into the King James. But in reality, it's not in any Greek New Testament manuscripts. All right, and just, it's one of those obvious ones. It needs to be rejected. It was not there. It's really just because of shenanigans that it even made it into the KJV. If you would turn to Romans chapter 5. Actually, we're going to wait on that in a second. If we have time, we'll talk about it.
Hey, Eric.
Yes, sir.
That's, you were talking about the KJV and they have,
No. Yes, go ahead.
not like they're afraid, I don't remember what word you used, but that's one example, because the KJV only people find that verse, they're like, that's the Trinity right there, and if you take that out, ESV,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things that they say, which is crazy.
That is, and if that is your only argument for the Trinity,
You get
right, then
Yeah.
you're in trouble. I mean, yeah. So we had 4 different types of manuscripts. I'm going to show them to you real quick. You can go online and find this one. Just type in Codex Sinaiticus, and you will find codexsinaiticus.org. So this is a 4th century manuscript. If you see a Greek manuscript with 4 columns anywhere on the internet, it is probably this manuscript, because it is, last time I checked, the only existing Greek New Testament manuscript with 4 columns per page. So it's pretty solid. Let's zoom in. We've seen Codex Vaticanus, right? Codex Vaticanus, when we looked at, had handwriting that was very much like this, right? Everything is uppercase, all right? No spaces, no punctuation.
So is that majuscule? Is it all over here?
This is what would be called majuscule. That's right. And this was an extremely common writing form in the early centuries AD. Right? Later on, that was not the case. This is Vaticanus, but we've looked at that one before. Let's talk about some other interesting ones. So this is a papyrus, all right? So 3rd century, or 2nd or 3rd century. This is a collection of the letters of Paul. Right? And so if you go down here and look at it, this is what a papyrus looks like. Now, if you look at the text, you will see, oh, this is majuscule. All right? Wow, that's hard to read. Trust me, it's majuscule. Look up Chester Beatty Papyrus, you'll find some of this. But these are put on papyrus because typically they're very old, all right? And they just separate them out because they're old and not papyrus, all right? And so if I can make that lighter, I would. Let's talk about another kind. That's a fragment. We'll come back to that one. This is a good one. All right, so let me see. Can I make this full screen?
This is kind of a side question. How do they keep their columns so straight?
They probably had guides.
Sir?
They probably had guides. And you can even see in some where they would, even to keep the line straight, you would see an indentation where they made a little slight indentation in the manuscript. And so this is a minuscule, all right? This is more of a cursive thing, and I really want to get rid of all the stuff on the outside, but I'm failing to do so. So typically speaking, when you see one of these are later. This particular one was from 1204. If they have a specific date on it like that, that probably means that somewhere in it, probably at the end, the scribe is like, I wrote this in this year. Most of the times, manuscripts are like, it's probably this century. But there's a specific date here. So this is a minuscule. It's got very flowing Greek text, all right? The letters are not distinct, and often they will combine letters into what are called ligatures. We have ligatures too in English, people sometimes use, all right? And so you can combine things like common words and such. Now this is a, no, let me find, I wanted to show you a lectionary. Here it is. That's the lectionary fragment. Well, we are out of time. I will show you this one. What do you think's going on here? I'm going to blame the projector changing my screen.
Is it under a black light?
UV. Yep. This is what the manuscript looks like to normal human eyes. All right. This is what is called a palimpsest. All right. Palimpsest means it is written on again. And if you've got what is a piece of parchment, all right. If you have something with parchment, you can actually, if you don't want a particular word there, you can scrape off the top level layer enough where you can still write and your new writing will be clear. If you look here, there's one layer of writing and then there's stuff in the middle. This is a case where the undertext, where somebody scripted off, was a New Testament manuscript, and somebody scripted off and wrote something on top of it. And you can do like UV light or multispectral imaging, and you can actually see these undertexts easier. This is for the Center Study of New Testament Manuscripts, which is centered on the tollway at the tollway in Custer in the Hope Building. They sometimes, they do things like this, so they can get to these manuscripts. Multispectral imaging takes lots of images at different levels or with different types of light to try to pull this stuff out. It's super fancy. But when you care about the New Testament text, you get really inconvenienced so you can read it. That's okay, right? Which is the same reason why a lot of people are great. It's really inconvenient to learn a foreign language. I don't know if you know that. So that is another manuscript. And so 9th and 10th century, a palimpsest. Something written again after it has been rubbed off, literally. And this was most of what I wanted to cover, though I wanted to talk about Romans chapter 5, but I don't get to do it. I never seen that enough time. Any final questions? Any final thoughts?
What are the manuscripts that you looked up that have black and red ink? Is there a reason for
That is common in lectionaries. But yeah,
We could
It-
do a
it's-
questionnaire.
so some of the manuscripts will have different colors of ink. That's actually really common in lectionaries, where you will have the main text in one color, and then text like a little summary or a heading in another color. And you'll see that like at the books, even in non-lectionaries, you'll see that like at the beginning of books. When you get into really fancy manuscripts, people will do a lot of artwork and things, and they will often do that. They'll do like drop caps. You know what drop caps are? Where drop caps is where like you take the first letter of a word in a paragraph and you make it huge and all the text flows around it. They did that in ancient manuscripts, and you see it in there. And they'll often do those in different colors and things. And so, you know, the typical way of writing would be to use black ink. But you'll even find manuscripts that were dyed purple and written in gold. So that would be a very expensive manuscript to have. But that's actually a thing. Any other questions? Yeah.
It seems like you'd have to have something very important to write down to write over New Testament stuff. Do you know what they scrape that off to write?
No, but I do want to look. I don't actually know. Yeah. It actually could have been another New Testament manuscript. I just haven't checked. Like, this one's old and faded. We'll scrape off the old and write something new. Actually don't know. I haven't checked.
So for those of us who are old enough to remember onion skin paper, when you would type a letter, you have regular paper on the front, and you have your carbon paper, and then you have onion skin, because if you had a typographical error, you could use whiteout on the top page, but the back page, we had to scrape in the onion skin paper. You could retype whatever the correct thing was, so. anyway,
And you will also
it's
see that
just
too,
a
actually.
memory.
Yeah, you will also see people scraping out there or correcting on the fly. And I'll show you one. That Codex Sinaiticus example actually had that exact thing in it. It was in the second column. See, this is they really need a web developer to come work on their website.
I just think it's really cool that obviously that technique was learned from this type of activity.
It totally was.
That you could scrape if you had the right kind of paper, because if you used traditional typing paper, you couldn't scrape off of the paper because you didn't have the layers or the texture that the onion skin paper had.
And, you know, if you go to the trouble of typing out something, it's really annoying to have to retype an entire page, right? Just think how much worse it is if you're handwriting it, right?
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
even slower. And so you're like, I'm not gonna start over. I'm gonna scrape it off. Or, like this particular example, this was the last textual variant we were talking about, is a single letter, where the manuscript was written with an omega, and somebody came in, a corrector, made it their own correction. Changes the reading of that particular, of Romans chapter 5, verse 1. But we don't have time, some of the time.
This was written
Fourth
by
century.
hand. This is written by hand with a writing instrument quill, ink. I am really impressed with their parallel to each other. The letters are all exactly the same size. It looks like it's machine printed. And they're parallel with the edge and the top. And each line is spaced exactly. I'm sorry, I'm looking at that as an engineer.
It's,
Okay, and it's amazing that a person can do this by hand and write a line that doesn't, if I was doing it, the lines would be like this.
and somebody made a comment a few weeks ago, I won't mention who, you know, it looks like a child wrote it, right? Because it's all uppercase. But really, yeah, if you look at it, there's just regularity there and precision that whoever did this, and recently they would use like reed pens, would be a common way of doing it. I tried using like a bamboo pen recently, and it's really annoying. It's super annoying, and they did it because it was worth it for them, right?
Well, it looks machine printed.
Because you don't get to just write. It's write a few letters. Write a few letters. Oh no, there might be too much ink on my pen. And deal, so annoying.
The
It's amazing.
painstakingly slow.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's why these manuscripts are so expensive. Not just the writing material, the man hours, the man months, or the man years, depending on the length of the manuscript.
Well, writing so slow and so precisely gave them time to consider, to think, to compare. They didn't jot it down in a hurry.
Certainly not this guy.
Not that. That's amazing.
If anybody wants to talk about any of these things, just let me know. I'll be available at lunch. If there's anything that anybody would like to cover in more detail in the future, also just let me know. But for now, we must be dismissed. So, Grady, will you please close the call?
Well, we